Hello, everyone, and welcome to Royals at the Ranch, episode 15. This was going to be episode 12, and then it was going to be episode 13. But one of our first two Royals at the Ranch, Aminette, chose to come out, and I took a lot of footage of her when she was out of her habitat by choice and exploring around her room. And I used that as a good educational experience for her and for me and for all of you. And so the last two episodes pretty much highlighted Aminette and her adventures outside of her enclosure, and we went over some choice-based handling things, some passive habituation techniques, how to introduce touch and handling, and then kind of when to know when to put your snake back if they've been out for exercise. So now we're at episode 14, and I should call this the episode where I make everybody mad. Yeah, you'll see why. So in this episode, we are going to pick up with the Moon and Aminette, our first two Royals at the ranch. They were the two Royals that I brought here to do a habitat preference test with, to see if their behavior indicated a preference for a tub or a semi-naturalistic habitat. And we're going to fast forward to 13 months later from the last time you saw them, and I'm going to go over my conclusions based on these two individuals, one male, one female, both about the same age, just 2 months apart. They both arrived here at less than a year old, so they were still babies. And here are my conclusions. Given the choice between a rack-style tub and a pseudo-naturalistic habitat with a clear front, both snakes preferred the habitat. And in this case, it was initially a chondro tub, and then after their brief time in that, they were moved along with their rack bin so that they would have the option to access and live in that if they wanted. It was a fully furnished bin, like a shoebox type bin, but a little bit bigger because these animals were now close to a year old, that had a hide in it, a water bowl, and paper towel for substrate. So that was moved with them into a 36 by 23 by 21 PVC enclosure by Vision with sliding glass doors, and it was fully furnished, and I described that furnishing in episode 10. There was a hole in their tub, and they were free to leave it if they wanted and be in the habitat at large or remain in their tub. And both snakes spent very little time in the tub. They did not live in it. One snake ended up shedding in it when he would go through his ecdysis cycles, and the other snake ended up using it as a bathroom or toilet area. That is where I found all her waste materials when I did cleaning. So they didn't live in it. They preferred to reside in the habitat at large. Both snakes preferred cooler temperatures than what I had read in most care sheets. They avoided temperatures higher than 82 degrees in general, and I only observed them using a hot spot once or twice, sort of just to test it out, I think, and explore it and see what it was. But they just did not use a hot spot, and that hot spot was about 85 or 86 degrees. So they were remaining in 82 or lower ambient spots. They just didn't prefer to be hot. That's what I observed from these two individuals. And this has been over a year of observation. Now, if we flash forward to the present day, which is September 2021, of course, I've been observing them for 2 years, and I still stand by what's written here. I haven't seen any behavior that's different from what I have in these bullet points. So they were more active, climbed more, and utilized more space than is reported in popular culture. And they sought out humidity less than is commonly reported in popular culture. And when I say popular culture, in this case, I mean the reptile community. So this is why I say I'm going to make everybody mad, because all of the breeders out there that keep their royal pythons in tubs and racks and who think that that's the best way to keep them or advise others to keep them that way, that's not what they prefer when given the option to live in that environment or live in a larger habitat that's a pseudo-naturalistic habitat, because I don't use bioactive. I use a combination of some vines and real branches and real substrate and rocks, and then plastic stuff and manufactured items too. So I just make the habitat so that they are able to express species typical behaviors in addition to some novel behaviors. And it's not completely naturalistic, it's not bioactive, but it's also not completely sterile. It's a combination. So definitely these two individuals preferred the habitat at large, and they preferred cooler temperatures and less humidity. Given the option to have higher temperatures and higher humidity, they preferred less. And again, this is two individuals that I studied for over a year. All right, here are the conclusions continued. And again, based on two individuals, a male and a female, both about the same age. In regards to eating, both snakes exhibited observable behavior changes when they were ready to eat. So when they were hungry and ready to eat, they actively hunted, they actively got into ambush postures, and other aspects of their behavior changed. They were awake for longer periods than normal. They moved around their habitat more than normal. And they did things outside of what was normal when they weren't hungry. And I believe that that's probably to increase opportunities to encounter prey. So they were awake for a longer period of time. They covered more space, and they definitely got into ambush positions more, and they were more reactive to the slightest movement than normal. So for example, on a normal day, I wouldn't hesitate to reach in and freshen their humid hide or mist their enclosure, or spot clean or change water. But when they were in this hunting mode, I would not do those things because I think they would have struck at any movement. So there was a definite observable behavior change when it was time to feed them. The in-between meal latency varied widely, and I do solely behavior-based feeding. And there were times when they would eat in a very, very short period of time, several meals, and then there were times when they would go a long period of time without any meals. And I'm going to do a whole video about that because I took over a year's worth of data. And then both snakes used all their habitat space. They sought time out of their enclosures occasionally, and they spent time on the ground as well as in the upper half of their vertical space. So they did not solely remain on the ground. They did spend quite a bit of time using all of their vertical space. Oh, and I just see that I missed a bullet up there. They were and are eating both rats and mice. They don't seem to prefer, these two individuals don't seem to prefer one over the other. Their ambush posturing occurred on the ground as well as in the upper half of their vertical space. So sometimes they would get in that ambush posture inside their cave, and they would put the first third of their body out in an ambush position, and then sometimes they would get in the very top of their enclosure and they would hang off a branch or hang off a ledge in a hanging down ambush position. They generally exhibited similar behaviors to other python species, except that their default defense behavior is to freeze hide, and I'm going to talk more about that. So this is the part where I'm pretty sure I made some breeders mad because they just don't prefer to live in drawers. Given the option, one used it as a toilet and one used it to shed. Now, I will say that if the animal has only ever known a tub, they were raised in one and now they've grown to be an adult and they're living in a rack bin or tub, then it is difficult to transition them to a habitat enclosure because they don't know anything different. And anytime you try to transition an individual from what they have always known, whether that's an extremely extravagant enriched environment or not, it doesn't matter. But when you're making drastic changes for an individual from one way of life to another, it's always going to be distressful for them. And it requires some finessing to make sure that that transition happens and is successful and goes smoothly. And that is the story of our Royal Python fulcrum, which we are going to detail in a series of episodes. How do royal pythons compare to other python species? Now, this is my opinion, and it's based on my observations of the python species we keep here and that I personally work with. So I'm not comparing them to pythons I don't work with and don't keep here. This is based on, at the time that I made this presentation, 6 royal pythons and 63 other pythons. The 63 other pythons include 59 Morelia, 2 Antaresia, and 2 other, and those 2 other are an Angolan python and a superdwarf reticulated python. All right, let's go to this first bullet. Royals, in general, let me also make this statement. This is in general. You will always have outliers who don't fit the norm, and the majority of the behaviors the rest of their conspecifics exhibit. So I'm talking overall in general. So not every royal python will have these tendencies. Not every other python is going to have these other tendencies. They're going to be outliers, but I'm just talking about in general overall. Royals tend to be shy, hesitant, cautious, and they tend to hide very often. Other pythons tend to be more bold, confident, resilient, outgoing, and they tend to be all or partially visible more of the time. They use their total habitat space. Yes, they absolutely do. Other pythons also use their total habitat space. That's the ground and the vertical space. They use the whole thing. However, royals tend to move around slower, and so they won't make as many rounds around their space during their active and awake periods as other pythons will. Other pythons tend to move around that space more quickly and repeatedly. Royals tend to be less physically active, spend less time moving around the space before coming to rest. And other pythons seem to be more physically active. They spend more time moving around the space before they decide to rest for the night or the morning, depending on when they're normally active. Royals spend more time terrestrially than arboreally, but they do spend time in the upper half of their vertical space, just not as much as other pythons. So the other pythons I work with tend to spend a lot of time arboreally, and hardly do I find them on the ground. The royals basked less, and the other pythons that I work with bask more. Now, when I say more and less, I am comparing these to each other. So not the snake world at large, but when I say royals bask less, that means they bask less than these other pythons I observed. And when I say something like these other pythons bask more, I mean they bask more than royal pythons do. So I'm comparing these two groups to each other, not to outside snakes that I have not personally observed and do not personally work with. Royals spend little or no time submerged in water. The ones that I have here, they drink, but I just don't see them swimming or soaking in their water. And the other pythons I do see swimming and soaking from time to time. Royals are responsive to training. Yes, absolutely. They are responsive to training just the way the other pythons are. I would say both groups are equally responsive to learning things like stationing, target training, passive habituation, active habituation, and handling. However, royals progress in that training more slowly as compared to the other python species I work with, which seem to progress in that training very, very quickly. Royals seek time out of their enclosure less frequently than the other pythons. So both of these groups that I'm comparing do occasionally ask to come out of their enclosures and will roam around the room or use exercise spaces. However, the royals just seek that time outside of their habitats less than these other python species that I've been working with. Royals hide more and they're just less visible. It's just something about the species. I just don't see them as much as I see the other pythons, who quite frankly seldom hide completely. They're frequently visible, and even when they do hide, they're usually at the entrance to their hide so they can still see out, or only part of their body will be hidden and part of it will be visible. Again, based on the 6 royals that I worked with up until I made this presentation, and the 63 other pythons, which included carpet pythons, Brettles pythons, a rough-scaled python, 2 children's pythons, a reticulated python, and an Angolan python. Royals are the comfort and relaxation that they have with handling depends on prior training, prior experience, and history with people and just individual personality. And that's exactly the same as the other pythons. Comfort and relaxation with handling depends on training, prior experience, and individual personality. All right, now let's talk about the typical defensive behavior or the typical default behavior when they are feeling threatened. It's also called anti-predator behavior. Typical for Python Regis is to freeze and hide. And that's that behavior you see when they curl up in a ball and try to hide their head within their coils. Other Python species typically do not freeze and hide when they feel threatened. When they are in defensive mode, they either exhibit escape and avoidance behavior. That can be rapid movement or retreating, but trying to avoid whatever that stimulus is and escape from it. And when they're unable to do that, or some of them right off the bat are going to fight. So they're going to strike and hiss and exhibit that more aggressive type of defense behavior. And I do want to point out here as a good reminder that anytime a snake species or other animal is exhibiting anti-predator behavior, defensive behavior, what some people term as aggressive behavior, it is a distance creating behavior. It is a behavior they are doing in order to protect themselves and ideally create distance between them and whatever they find threatening or perceive as a potential threat. I want to remind you that there will always be exceptions and outliers, and I have some examples in the group of snakes that I work with. One of our 6 royals, Seric, actually fits the behavioral profile of the other pythons closer than he does to his own conspecifics. And then 6 of the other pythons, 2 of the Bredli and 4 of the Papuan carpet pythons, exhibit a behavioral profile that actually fits a little bit closer to how royals behave than their own conspecifics. And so, as I said, these things I'm telling you are in general, and I'm making some generalizations about a species as a whole or about a family of pythons as a whole or a genus as a whole, and there's always going to be exceptions. All right, here's where I'm going to make the rest of you mad. I made the breeders mad, now I'm going to make everybody else mad. Do royals make good first pet snakes? No. Of course there are exceptions, but in general, I do not recommend Python Regis as a first snake for somebody. I think they make excellent second snakes or additional snakes. When you already have a snake that meets all of your needs and desires and you're already satisfied with, I think royals make great family members and great pets. Why do I think this? Because when I look at what the typical pet owner wants in a pet, wants in an animal, wants in a snake, it isn't for them to hide all the time, only be awake when that family is asleep, and not interact with them readily. And so royal pythons are inherently shy and they hide often. They're more prone to nighttime only visibility and activity. And unlike me, who is a night person and I work most of the night, most people, I guess, sleep at night and are awake during the day, and royals tend to be the opposite. They are more inactive than other pythons and than colubrid snakes. And I think that families want snakes that are active, that they can see doing stuff and that they can interact with and who won't be afraid of that interaction. Their default anti-predator defense behavior is to freeze hide, and it makes them easy to take advantage of. And this causes them even more fear, anxiety, and distress on top of whatever initially triggered that response in the first place. So what I am saying is they get easily frightened and are very reactive to environmental stimuli because they're inherently shy. And so they go into this balling up behavior where they hide their head, and their anti-predator behavior isn't usually to strike, although they can. And so people take advantage of that. The snake is balled up and hiding and terrified, and people handle them and pick them up anyway and undo them from their coil. That is causing them even more anxiety and stress and fear. And so then there are going to be repercussions when you do that to them, like they go off food or they hide even more after they've had that experience. These are some other reasons why, in general, I think royals do not make the best first pet snake. So again, I mentioned this in the previous slide, and it's super important, so I'm mentioning it again. They ball up and hide their heads when frightened, and they tend not to strike. And so this makes them super vulnerable to abuse in the form of flooding and overhandling. So like I said before, they're not striking, they're not overtly aggressive. Oh, they're just curled up in a little ball, and you pick them up anyway, and you overhandle them, and you flood them with your presence and your touching, and they're terrified and they're scared, or they wouldn't be balled up in the first place. And so again, that's going to cause other problems, such as they already have inconsistent feeding patterns to begin with. I'm going to do a video about that because I've tracked the natural feeding patterns of the ones that I have under captive management for over a year. So the feeding patterns are very inconsistent. They don't eat once a week or once every 10 days. They might eat 2 or 3 times in 1 week and then not eat for 2 months or 3 months or 6 weeks. It's very sporadic. So they're already prone to that. And then when they experience chronic stress due to overhandling and or forced interactions from their caretakers, then they're going to eat even less. They're going to be less apt to eat when they really should be eating because they're experiencing chronic stress. Their natural behavior doesn't meet the expectations of what I feel most first-time pet snake keepers are going to want in a pet snake. Because when I talk to people who contact me and say, I'm thinking of getting a first snake, what do you recommend? I have a whole list of questions that I ask them. And some of the common things that I hear in response are they want to be able to see their snake, they want it to be visible, they want it to be active, they want it to be awake when they are, and they want it to interact with them without being afraid and without biting them. And Royals just don't fit this for the most part. Now, Sarek, he's an outlier. The one Royal I have, if he was the first Royal Python and the only one I ever had, I would tell you they're just the best snakes ever because I love him. He's wonderful. But he does not fit the typical behavioral profile of Python Regis. And so those are the reasons why I think they don't make the best first pet snake. I think it's easy to abuse them without realizing that we're doing it. It's easy to frighten them when maybe we don't realize we're doing it. And then oftentimes families are disappointed in the snake's behavior because it does not meet their expectations of how they envisioned life with a pet snake. Okay, here's why I think they make great additional snakes. I've come to love mine so much that I have now more than the original 2 that I got to do the behavior study. I really like them as additional snakes. And this is why, when you already have 1 or more snakes that fit your expectations, that are meeting your needs and your wants, and that you're happy and satisfied with, it's easy to have other snakes. So you can add other species and have no expectations of it. You can now add another species that you don't personally need to fulfill all of your wants and needs. And now you can just enjoy that species for what it is. Because these other snakes that you have are satisfying your wants and desires, you can be content to let your Royals be themselves with no preconceived ideas or expectations. You can leave them alone and interact with them in ways that they make available to you when they're ready. And you can just be relaxed about observing them, enjoying them for who they are, and learning about your Python Regis without feeling that pressure of, oh, I want my snake to do this, but I want my snake to train. I want my snake to like to come out. I want my snake to be awake during the day. I don't want my snake falling up. I want to hold my snake. When you already have other snakes you're happy with, you can now have a Royal Python and enjoy it for what it is. So I really want people to value them for who they are, and without giving any thought to your wishes or what you wish they were. Just love them for who and what they are. And it's much easier to do that if they're not your only snake or they're not your first snake. What are the best first pet snakes? Well, it depends on you. All right, it totally depends on you, your individual preferences, what your expectations of the snake are. You need to articulate what life with your snake looks like in your mind, and then that's going to help guide you to a species that's going to be a good fit. Now, the best snakes for me, personally, if I wasn't working with them as an animal behaviorist and trainer, if I was just having them as pets to enjoy and train for fun, here is my top 5 list. And this is in alphabetical order, not in favorites order. Angolan pythons, Bredl's pythons, carpet pythons, corn snakes, and super dwarf reticulated pythons. For me personally, those are the best possible snakes for me to live with and have as part of my family and interact with. I love them. That list may look different for you. You really need to be honest with yourself and answer a whole bunch of questions, but mainly, what does life with your ideal snake look like? And you answer those questions first, and then you start investigating species and seeing which species are going to meet your criteria, your expectations. And don't just get a species based on how they look or what other people tell you you should get. Well, now that I've made everyone mad, breeders and people who have royal pythons as part of their families, let me make it up to you by showing you everyone's favorite segment, Royals in Your Homes. I hope you all enjoyed that. I really did enjoy watching that. And now this week's special segment is going to be some words on welfare. Currently, right now, as I'm recording this on Morph Market, there are over 26,000 royal pythons for sale. And as much as I love snakes and I love royal pythons, that number is astonishing because those are just the ones for sale on Morph Market alone. That doesn't include the ones for sale locally, maybe in local classifieds or in other online selling platforms. There are 26,827 ball pythons right now for sale in the United States on Morph Market. And I love looking at each and every one of them. I really do. I just love snakes. I think they're beautiful and I enjoy browsing on Morph Market. I'm addicted to it. But some things that I want you to consider if you're thinking of purchasing a snake, whether at a reptile expo, from a private individual, or through Morph Market, are the following. Are you prepared to provide space, heating, lighting, food, and veterinary care for a snake that may live 30 years? Are you physically capable of caring for your snake and its habitat for the next 30 years of your life? Do you have access to a veterinarian who specializes in exotic pets? Do you have someone who's willing to care for your snake if you have to be away for a while or you go on vacation? Or do you have someone who's prepared to take on the responsibility of permanently caring for your snake if something happens to you? And will you always be kind and love your snake for its entire life? These are all things that I hope you consider before getting a snake or adding another snake to your family. Think first, then act. Consider that taking on the care of another living thing is a huge responsibility. That life is solely reliant on you. The life and welfare of another individual is totally in your hands, dependent on you and at your mercy. So please plan first before you proceed. Thank you everyone for making it through this, for sticking with me, and for following the story of Amun and Amunet. In conclusion, based on watching Amun and Amunet for over a year and watching them during the time when they were naturally awake and active, keeping a journal of their behavior, their habits, and activity, it was clear that they chose to spend their time in a furnished PVC enclosure using their juvenile rack bins just for shedding and elimination behavior. Based on the feedback that I get from people about what they want in a pet snake, I don't think royal pythons are the best choice of a first pet snake, but I do think they make excellent family members and that they're an excellent second snake or additional snake for your family. No matter what species of snake or other animal you add to your family, please be prepared to love and care for it their entire life. Next time, what do you want to see? Should we start with another story, one of our other royals, and follow them through their journey here? Should we watch arrivals and unboxing of the royals and the first steps after a royal arrives here? Do you want one of our special segments expanded into a complete episode? Or are you interested in something else? Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, everybody, please remember to always be kind and love your animals.